Imagine walking into a packed open-air amphitheater in ancient Athens. You sit down on these cold stone benches, the chorus enters, and you watch the actors on stage actively accuse Apollo of being a violent, hypocritical monster.
Right, which is wild because he was one of their most sacred, unquestionable deities.
Exactly. And this doesn't start a riot. It doesn't, get the playwright exiled for blasphemy. Instead, it literally sells out the house.
It's a staggering image, honestly, especially when you consider how deeply entwined Athenian civic identity was with their religion. It fundamentally challenges how we usually view ancient societies and their myths.
Yeah, so welcome to today's custom deep dive. We have gathered a fascinating stack of sources based on Edith Hamilton's research, specifically focusing on the infamous Royal House of Athens.
Which is quite the family tree.
Oh, it really is. And the mission today for you, our listener, isn't just to walk through an old mythological family tree. We're going to track a massive shift in human consciousness.
Yeah, we're exploring how ancient Greek society's relationship with its own religion evolved.
Right, starting from this, unquestioning literal belief in half-dragon kings, all the way to a culture that weaponized theater to put their own gods on trial.
Because when you lay these sources out chronologically, you realize these myths weren't just static fairy tales. I mean, they were a dynamic, evolving technology.
That technology, I like that.
Yeah, the Athenians used it to grapple with everything from political inequality to the darkest corners of human psychology, and ultimately, the friction between human morality and divine impunity.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we have to start at the absolute foundation of the Athenian royal line with a figure named Cecrops.
Right, the very first one.
According to the early myths, Cecrops was the first king of Attica, which is the broader region that encompasses the city-state of Athens. And he wasn't just some powerful warlord. The sources describe him as being half human and half dragon.
Specifically, he had a dragon-shaped lower half.
Which is just an incredible mental image.
Right. But that physical description is actually doing a lot of heavy lifting historically, because it signifies that he had no outside human ancestors. He was literally sprung from the earth of Attica itself.
Ah, so it gave the Athenians a claim to, absolute indigeneity.
Exactly. And his reign is really famous because it serves as the backdrop for how Athens got its patron deity, the ultimate divine competition.
Yes. Poseidon and Athena both want to be the protector of this shiny, emerging city. I've always viewed this myth like an ancient municipal zoning dispute.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. But instead of tax breaks, the deities are offering massive public works projects. So Poseidon strikes the Acropolis with his trident, creating this dramatic saltwater well. And Athena responds by growing the very first olive tree.
Which, honestly, was a strategic masterstroke. I mean, in the Mediterranean economy, the olive tree was the ultimate resource. It provided food, fuel, oil, and timber.
So Cecrops, acting as the judge, decides Athena's utilitarian gift outweighs Poseidon's dramatic one. But the sources provide a brilliant alternate version of this myth, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And it's one that shifts the decision away from a single king and places it in the hands of the citizens.
And this is where we see the myth doing some really fascinating socio-political work. So in this alternate telling, there is a democratic vote. All the men of the city vote for Poseidon, and all the women vote for Athena.
And because there happens to be exactly one more woman than there are men, Athena wins.
Which is amazing. But Poseidon, naturally, does not take the loss gracefully.
No, not at all. He sends a devastating flood to ravage Attica. And, this brings us to a crucial psychological mechanism of early myth.
Right. How does a society deal with a natural disaster?
Exactly. When they believe the gods are personally and directly responsible for the weather, they have to find a way to appease the angry deity. So the men of Athens strip the women of their right to vote.
It's just an incredibly convenient narrative, isn't it?
Oh, highly convenient.
I mean, the men secure a monopoly on political power, but they get to completely wash their hands of the guilt by blaming divine wrath. They essentially weave a narrative saying, look, we didn't want to disenfranchise half the population, but the sea god left us no choice.
Yeah, it's an etiology. It's a myth designed specifically to explain and justify why current societal structures exist. The Athenians used the concept of divine retribution to impartially explain the origins of real-world political inequalities.
Wow. But you can see how a myth like that only works for grand societal explanations. Eventually, Athenians needed their stories to explain something much more complicated and intimate, which is human psychology.
Right, the messy stuff.
Exactly. And we see that narrative evolution perfectly when we look at Cecrop's descendants, specifically his granddaughters, Procne and Philomele.
Right, so Procne is married off to Tereus of Thrace, who is the son of Ares, and after 5 years of marriage and the birth of their son, Itygas, Procne asks Tereus to go to Athens and bring her sister, Philomela, for a visit.
But the moment Tereus lays eyes on Philomela, he becomes completely obsessed. So he takes her back toward Thrace. But before they reach the palace, he orchestrates this horrific deception.
He tells Philomela that her sister is dead.
Yes, and he forces her into a fake marriage. When Philomela discovers the truth, she is rightfully enraged and threatens to expose him to the entire world.
And this is where it gets really dark.
Yeah, to silence her, Tereus cuts out her tongue and locks her in a heavily guarded compound. Now, looking at the primary texts, there is a distinct tonal shift here. Like if you read early Greek poetry, visceral violence almost always happens offstage.
True, they prefer to allude to it.
Right, but this specific story dips straight into explicit horror. Why the sudden shift into slasher territory here?
Well, it really comes down to transmission and the literary context of the surviving sources. I mean, while this originated as a Greek myth, the most complete version we rely on actually comes from the Roman poet Ovid. And unlike the classical Greeks, the Romans had absolutely no philosophical objection to explicit gore. Ovid luxuriates in the violence. He spends like 15 lines detailing the amputation. He famously describes the severed tongue as palpitating on the earth where Tereus flung it.
Wow, just a gruesome cinematic detail.
Yeah.
And it completely changes the texture of the myth. But returning to the narrative, Philomela is trapped. She is voiceless, and formal writing as a tool of communication really hasn't been established in this era.
No, it hasn't.
But she leverages the one technology available to noble women of her time, which is the loom. She weaves a wondrous tapestry, meticulously detailing her exact wrongs. Her face, Tereus's face, the violent betrayal, she weaves it all into the fabric and smuggles it to the queen.
Which is just a brilliant subversion of enforced silence. I mean, it's the world's first true crime documentary told via textile.
I love that description. So Procne receives the tapestry, reads the woven narrative instantly, and rescues her sister. But the revenge Procne enacts is unthinkable.
Yeah, looking at her own young son, Idatis, she sees the face of the husband who betrayed her family. She kills the boy, cooks him, and serves him to Tereus for supper.
Just brutal. And it's only at the very end of this bloodbath, as Tereus realizes what he just ate and draws his sword to kill the sisters, that the gods finally step in. They transform all three of them into birds.
Right, Tereus becomes a hawk. Procne becomes the nightingale, singing a mournful song for her lost son. And the tongueless Philomela becomes the swallow, a bird that can only chatter and never really sing.
Although, didn't you mention there is a fascinating transmission error in literary history regarding those birds?
Yes. Later, Roman writers completely confused the two sisters. They accidentally assigned the identity of the nightingale, the bird famous for its beautiful, melancholic song, to the tongueless Philomela.
Which makes absolutely no logical sense within the framework of the myth. She literally doesn't have a tongue.
None at all. But the mistake became codified. It's why centuries of English poetry continually and incorrectly refer to the singing nightingale as Philomela.
That is wild. But if we look past the avian transformations, notice the role of the divine in this story. The gods are merely bookends here.
Right. The tragedy itself is propelled entirely by human depravity, human obsession, and human revenge.
So if the gods are essentially taking a backseat to human violence there, how does divine intervention evolve as Athenian storytelling matures? Because in the next generation, with Procris and her husband Cephalus, the gods do get involved again, but they stop being blunt instruments.
Yeah, they start becoming psychological manipulators.
Exactly. So Cephalus is a fiercely loyal husband, and he catches the eye of Aurora, the goddess of the dawn. She kidnapped him, but he outright refuses her advances, insisting his heart belongs solely to Procris.
And Aurora is deeply humiliated by this. She ultimately releases him, but before she does, she plants a highly toxic seed of doubt. She tells him to go back to his wife, but suggests that perhaps Procris hasn't been as perfectly faithful in his absence as he was.
Which is such a calculated, insidious move. Aurora knows she can't win his love, so she decides to ruin it instead.
Yeah, and it works flawlessly.
It really does. Cephalus is driven mad by the mere suggestion. He becomes obsessed with testing his wife's loyalty. He initiates this extreme, ancient version of a psychological loyalty test, like toxic reality TV or ancient catfishing.
That's exactly what it is.
He uses divine magic to completely alter his appearance, returns to his own home as a stranger, and sets about trying to seduce his own wife.
It is a masterclass in psychological torture. I mean, Procris continuously rebuffs this stranger, insisting she's waiting for her husband. But Cephalus relentlessly badgers her. He wears her down with endless petitions and promises until, finally, she simply hesitates.
Just a moment of hesitation.
Right. She doesn't even agree to his advances. She just drops her firm opposition for a fraction of a second.
And that tiny hesitation is all the excuse he needs. He drops the disguise, reveals his true identity, and viciously shames her for the very crack in her armor that he spent weeks manufacturing.
Naturally, the marriage shatters. Procris flees to the mountains. It is no cruelty and begs for forgiveness.
And they reconcile, right?
They do, but the psychological damage really sets the stage for physical tragedy.
Right. Because earlier, Procris had given Cephalus a magical javelin that never misses its target. One day, while they are hunting in the woods, they get separated. Cephalus sees a rustling in a thicket. Assuming it's a wild animal, he throws the never-failing javelin.
But it was Procris moving in the brush.
Yeah, she is pierced to the heart by her own gift.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the evolution of divine involvement is striking here. Think back to the first myth. Poseidon just sends a flood, a blunt, physical instrument of wrath.
Right, just brute force.
But here, Aurora doesn't strike anyone with lightning. She doesn't physically force Cephalus to throw that javelin. She merely exploits his pre-existing human insecurity. She basically hands a mortal the psychological rope and calmly watches him hang himself.
It shows a much deeper, more nuanced understanding of how tragedy actually works in human lives. And that psychological complexity bleeds directly into the politics of the next story, involving Procris's sister, Orithyia, and her suitor, Boreas, the god of the north wind.
Now this is a fascinating connection.
It is. The Athenian royal family aggressively refuses Boreas's proposal, and the reasoning here is brilliant. They refuse him because they now harbor a deeply entrenched prejudice against anyone from the north. And why is that?
Because Tereus, the man who cut out Philomelas' tongue and ate his own son, was from Thrace.
Which is in the north.
Right. It's a profound narrative detail. The untreated trauma of the previous generation is actively dictating the political and marital alliances of the current one. The Athenians are projecting the sins of one mortal onto a deity simply based on geography.
But Boreas, being a god of the wind, doesn't really care about their geopolitical trauma. He simply sweeps down in a violent gust and carries Orithyia away. On the surface, this reads like just another standard abduction myth.
It does, yeah.
But centuries later, this specific story becomes the focal point for a massive philosophical awakening.
Yes, we jump forward to the late 5th century BC. The primary source here is a dialogue recorded between the great philosopher Socrates and a young student named Phaedrus.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So they are walking along the banks of the river Ilissus. Phaedrus looks around the landscape and casually asks, Socrates, isn't this the exact spot where Boreas is said to have carried off Orithyia?
Socrates politely corrects him, noting the mythical spot is probably a quarter-mile further down the stream. But then Phaedrus asks the million-dollar question, which is, do you believe the story?
And Socrates replies with a sentence that changes the trajectory of Western thought. He says, the wise are doubtful, and I should not be singular if I too doubted.
The wise are doubtful.
Yeah.
That is such a quiet but devastatingly powerful phrase. Why is that specific moment so critical to our understanding of this culture?
Because it is the exact historical mechanism of change. We are watching rational skepticism take root in real time. Socrates isn't violently attacking the religion, he is simply applying logic.
Right, he's just asking questions.
Exactly. He goes on to suggest to Phaedrus that perhaps Orithyia wasn't abducted by a wind god at all. Perhaps she was just a mortal girl who was blown off a cliff by a strong gust of northern wind, and over generations, human imagination and grief personified that wind into a god to make sense of the tragedy.
He strips away the supernatural to reveal the human coping mechanism underneath, but Socrates kept his doubts relatively quiet, discussing them on riverbanks with students.
Yeah, it was a private conversation.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting. Taking that quiet philosophical skepticism and weaponizing it for the masses. And that is exactly what the playwright Euripides does.
Euripides was an absolute master of taking these sacred foundational myths and exposing their deeply uncomfortable moral hypocrisies to the general public. I mean, theater in ancient Athens wasn't just weekend entertainment. It was a major civic and religious festival.
So the stakes are incredibly high.
Very high. And Euripides uses this massive platform to tell the story of Creusa, the next in the royal line, and her son, Ion.
So the narrative begins with yet another divine assault. Creusa is a young girl gathering flowers in a cave when she is cornered by Apollo, the god of light, the god of absolute truth. He forces himself on her and then vanishes.
And when it's time for the baby to be born, Creusa returns to that dark cave alone, delivers her son, and leaves him there to die.
Which, to a modern ear, sounds unfathomably cruel. But the sources make it clear she was utterly terrified of society's deadly judgment on unwed mothers.
She operates out of sheer terror, and when her guilt finally overrides her fear and she returns to the cave, both the baby and the distinctive clothes she wrapped him in her own veil and a cloak she had woven, they're just gone.
So she assumes scavengers took him. She buries this trauma. Years later, she marries a foreigner named Xuthus. They are unable to conceive an heir, so they travel to Delphi.
Now, Delphi is the holiest shrine in all of Greece, and crucially, it is the domain of Apollo.
Right, so they go there to ask the god for a child, setting up a scenario practically dripping with dramatic irony. While her husband is inside consulting the oracle, Creusa waits in the outer courtyard. She strikes up a conversation with a beautiful young temple servant named Ion.
And Ion explains he doesn't know his parentage. He was found abandoned on the temple steps as an infant and raised by the priestess.
Feeling a strange connection, Creusa tells him a story, masking it as a hypothetical. She claims she is asking the god for advice regarding a friend who was assaulted by Apollo, forced to bear his child, and had to abandon it.
The psychological dynamic here is absolutely brilliant. I mean, Ion was raised within the institution of the temple. Apollo isn't just a god to him. Apollo is his employer, his guardian, his entire worldview.
So when Creusa indirectly accuses Apollo of assault and abandonment, Ion becomes defensive and hostile. He essentially tells her, "Your friend is lying. She slept with a mortal man and blamed the god to cover up her own shame."
It is a perfect depiction of institutional loyalty blinding someone to systemic abuse. Ion is cognitively incapable of accepting that his pure, shining god could be flawed, let alone a predator.
But the climax of the play shatters that loyalty, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. Xuthus emerges from the temple overjoyed, announcing that Apollo's oracle has declared Ion to be his long-lost son.
Which infuriates Creusa. I mean, from her perspective, her husband is just adopting a random, low-born temple boy to bypass her infertility.
Right, she feels completely replaced.
So before the situation devolves into violence, the aged priestess intervenes and brings out the ancient baby wrappings Ion was found in. Creusa freezes. She perfectly describes the embroidery on the cloth and the two little golden serpents she attached to it before even seeing them.
She proves definitively that Ion is her abandoned baby.
But this revelation sends Ion into an existential tailspin. Because if Creusa is his mother and Apollo forced her, then the god of truth just blatantly lied to Xuthus about being the father.
Ion's entire theological framework collapses right there, and right at that moment of ultimate crisis, Athena appears.
The classic deus ex machina, the god literally lowered from a crane onto the stage to magically resolve the messy plot. Athena confirms Apollo is Ion's true father, claims Apollo secretly rescued the baby from the cave, and instructs everyone to go back to Athens and rule happily ever after.
It feels like a tidy, traditional resolution, but you have to look at what Euripides is actually accomplishing here. He stages this neat divine intervention, but he knows the Athenian audience isn't fooled.
All right, the deus machina acts almost like a sarcastic band-aid over a gaping moral wound.
Exactly. Euripides is forcing the Athenian crowd to look at Apollo and realize that, by any rational standard, the god behaved abysmally. He assaulted a helpless girl, abandoned her to the terror of a solitary birth, let her agonize for years thinking her child was dead, and then lied to her husband to cover his tracks.
He systematically strips away divine immunity. And that brings us back to where we started. Euripides didn't get chased out of town for this. The audience engaged with it.
Because the society had matured. Euripides was openly judging the gods by ordinary human standards of mercy, honor, and self-control. And by human standards, the gods were found deeply lacking.
Yeah.
When a play that openly critiques divine impunity can draw a full, captivated house in Athens, you know the era of unquestioning, literal mythological belief has ended.
What a phenomenal trajectory. We started this deep dive with a society that needed a literal half-dragon king and a magical olive tree to explain their basic geography. We waded through the bloody textile-woven revenge of Procne and analyzed the sophisticated toxic mind games of Cephalus.
And the geography-based prejudice.
Right. We watched Socrates sit by a river and invent rational skepticism, and we ended up in an amphitheater where citizens learned to use art to interrogate the very deities they built their civilization around.
It perfectly illustrates that studying these sources isn't about memorizing genealogy or bird transformations. It's about tracing the evolution of human thought. We get to watch in real time how humans use storytelling to process their deepest traumas, to justify their political realities, and eventually to bravely challenge unquestioned authority.
Which is so powerful.
It is. And that leaves us with a highly relevant thread to pull on. I mean, Euripides used the stage to hold the untouchable sacred gods accountable to basic human morality. It forces you to wonder if the ancient Greeks eventually learned to look at their most powerful, unquestionable authorities and say, wait a minute, this behavior is unacceptable. What unquestioned authorities, institutions, or modern myths in our own world are just waiting for their own Euripides to put them on stage?
That is a brilliant question to carry forward. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive. Keep questioning, keep reading, and happy exploring.